Okay. So I want to express my views on a particular subject, and this time it's different. It's not my subject related to the subjects which I have been dealing with in my teaching, which are related to constitution, polity, international relation, etc. But quite relevant to that. That is, in this video, I'm going to be bilingual. Will be expressing both in English as well as Hindi. In fact, this is going to be based on India's language conundrum, India's language problem. This problem of language in India is not new. It is as old as Indian civilization itself. At least it is as old as the British Indian history. It's being raised even today in different contexts, sometimes in the context of the need for a national language of India, whether India is a nation or not, without going into this concern and the questions. There have been demand by some people. India should have a national language, and that national language is nothing but Hindi. Hindi. So this question has been being raised in different contexts. In context of globalization, there have been demand that Hindi should be the Indian response to global dominance, etc., etc. Let us try to understand India's language problem. Why language is a problem in India? Because the official language, the language in which the functions of government are conducted, in Constitution is set as English, also Hindi, along with Hindi. But for all effective purposes, it was all English. Constitutionally was Hindi, but for all practical purposes, English was continued. Despite demand, strengthening for Hindi, etc., there were so many movements, but there were counter movements also against Hindi. India has some problem, and that is misfortune also for India. It failed to have its own language, like China, Korea, Germany, Japan. These countries can be considered as fortunate that they succeeded in developing their own language as their language for all purposes, whether it's official purpose or national language or linked language or lingua franca, etc., for every purpose, for education, for justice, for law, for every purpose. These countries are fortunate, but by history, India failed to be so fortunate to have one language. Because India was a multilingual nation, a multilingual continent. From the very beginning, it was a continental, civilizational, what you call state or nation, whatever, but it was continental and multilingual, apart from multicultural. So India's history is full of linguistic diversities and having numerous languages. Somehow, during freedom movement, Hindi came to be the common choice for the language of communication between political leaders from different states, Madras, Bengal, Maharashtra, Punjab. Hindi emerged as a consensus language. The leaders started speaking to each other in Hindi. In this context, Mahatma Gandhi proposed that Hindi should be the national language, and national language means the link language. But in his idea, it was the language of India, but it was not Hindi. His idea of language was Hindustani. That was not exactly Hindi. If you compare India with China, if you compare India with other great countries, they have their own language. They are not dependent like India on a foreign language. And of course, in English is a foreign language, undoubtedly. It came to India in 17th, 16th, 17th and became a prominent language by the end of 19th century. And after independence, it was, during independence, Constituent Assembly recognized English as one of the official languages along with Hindi, but practically it was all English. Let us begin. What advantages a country has if it has its own language, nurtured through its own history, its own, I mean, history and culture. So, if you compare the countries which have adopted their own language, nurtured by their history and culture and civilization, so there are different results. There are, on the one hand, the countries which have developed their own traditional language as their modern language, for the language of their economic development, the language of their modern education. But on the other hand, there are another set of countries which adopted their own language, but they are not as developed as first set of countries. So we have the first set of countries: Germany, Japan, China, Korea, right? And many of the European countries, Norway, Sweden, these are all developed, highly developed countries on all scales, and they have their own language. They do not follow English language. So entire Europe, which is the most developed region in the world, they have their own language. English is not spoken in Netherlands or Sweden or Norway or Iceland, nowhere. France has its own language, Spain has its own language. And these are all, on all parameters, these are all developed countries, developed not only materially and economically, but developed in terms of human parameters: education, income, science and technology. So there have been scientific researches, and they attribute this development to the native language. So there has been scientific research proving that there is linkage between intelligence, research, geniusness, and your nativity of expression, the language in which you express. In case it was your own language, it was found that there are great connect between the native language and intelligence. So China, Japan, they are often credited for their growth, for their development to their own language. It is scientific. Yes, I do accept. I have read reports that yes, there is deeper connect between your native language. The native language flows through your blood and veins, no doubt about it. So it is easier to master the knowledge, and more important than mastering the knowledge, to think in most fundamental manner, original manner, innovate, invention, inventiveness and language, they flow side by side. Rather, inventiveness is not possible in a language that is borrowed language, and can say also immediately learned language. Inventiveness, originality, fundamentality of thinking, it's much more conveniently present and possible in the language in which you are born. The relation between man and language is not so superficial that you just borrow it and you start writing in it. A person may be writing in a foreign language, a borrowed language. For example, for me, English is a borrowed language, and I'm using it for certain purposes. So it is said that that's not my language in which I was born. There is language of your birth, the language in which you are born. The genius is possible in that language. Yes, I do accept it. I do believe in it because there are scientific basis of it. I have been a great supporter of it. But in case of India, what happened that the Indians, unfortunately, who fought their freedom movement so innovatively, so constructively, so genuinely, so devotedly, won their independence but lost their language, lost the battle of language. And when they came out of freedom movement with so-called independence and they made their constitution, then a tragedy wetted them. And that tragedy was what should be the common language for India. There were several languages in India. There were more than 20 languages which have of late been given place in Indian constitution, and they are now recognized as India's 22 national languages. India in fact had 22 or maybe 25 national languages. So India could not benefit from one language. Now the question is, was it possible for India to adopt one language, which could have been Hindi, as demanded so assertively, so strongly, so powerfully, but tragically, so ignorantly, Hindi? How much it was possible to adopt Hindi as a language? Following were the problems in adopting Hindi, right? Following problems, and they posed the very existential threat to Hindi. So unless it could have been imposed, the adoption of Hindi was not possible. And this is what happened. There was violent movements in Bengal and Tamil Nadu and Madras, South India, against imposition of Hindi. The vital question is, when you have so many languages with their own history, 2000 years and 3000 years old history, with their own so profound literature, constituting their own subnationalism, Bengali subnationalism, Assamese subnationalism, Tamil subnationalism, Kannada, Maratha, they're all subnationalities. How was it possible to adopt? It may have happened that in North India there could not have been much opposition, but in South India it was a matter of death and life. It was not only a matter of language, it was a matter of death and life. There were few pockets in South, few people and few leaders who certainly supported Hindi as the Indian languages. Both it might have been official language and also national language. But there were few pockets and few individuals. It was not possible to go against the, the mass. So Tamil was the question of mass. Telugu was the question of mass. Malayalam was the question of mass. How was it possible to adopt Hindi? So, in the meantime, what had happened during 19th century, the leaders of India's religious and social reform movement, not exactly Renaissance movement. India hardly had a Renaissance movement. So, in all parts of India during 1850 to 1900, there were reform movements, social reform movement. They were rather socio-religious, educational reform movement. The leaders of these movements, they had problem. They realized the importance of English more than the importance of their own language, local language. And it applies to all subnational movements, from Tamil to Malayalam to Maratha to Gujarat, everywhere, Assam, Bengal, everywhere. The leaders of 19th century reform movement, socio-religious educational reform movement, they were more inclined towards, because in their mind it was very much clear that English has certain advantage. The science was synonymous with English. When they compared English with their own language, then they found, and that finding was accurate, that their languages were the languages of literature in which mysticism could be best expressed, emotions could be best expressed, right? Literature could be written, philosophy could be discussed, debated. But there were problems. The science was not originated in India, it came from somewhere else. So at that time, they realized, and that could have been their problem. That was the time when the modern science, European knowledge could have been developed in native languages and not in 1950. But the leaders of 19th century, they were equally impassioned for both the language, English as well as their own native language. But English was their first choice. Whether he was in Assam, Anandaram Jekyll Phukan, or in Bengal, Rajaram Mohan Rai, and etc., the entire galaxy of the leaders. They were very much passionate about their own Bengali language, but at the same time, Rajaram Mohan Rai threatened to the extent that if English, if Persian and Sanskrit is to be adopted, are to be adopted as the language of education, then I have nothing to do with this education system. The education must be given in English, and it must be in European subjects, European literature, and mechanical science. The same applies to all the leaders. In Hindi heartland, they didn't focus on science. They were more focused on literature, development of modern Hindi literature. All right. So the very first generation leaders, they were more inclined towards English. Had there been efforts at that time to translate or reproduce the scientific knowledge of Europe into Indian languages, then they could have emerged, or they could have been helped to develop as scientific languages. The reality is that all these Indian languages, which are known as modern Indian languages, to have come from the Apabhransa of Sanskrit. Right? There were various Apabhransa regional basis. The Indian languages emerged from that. Right? So that was the time when this Indian languages could have been developed into scientific languages, but they remained the language of literature and music. Literature, music, mysticism, philosophy, etc. With the beginning of 20th century, some efforts, limited efforts, were made to make these languages scientific languages. Some very important translations were made, but these translations were so sporadic, so occasional, and so irregular. There was no organized effort. That could have been possible only when the original science could have been developed in India. You do not develop your language as scientific language by copying from somebody else. When you have science, when you have your own knowledge, so first it is a question of knowledge. Original knowledge is being produced in which language? So if your original language is only literature and mysticism and philosophy, then your language will be the carrier of this kind of knowledge. Your language is not suitable for carrying the science knowledge, the language of science. This is how Indian languages remained devoid of scientific temperament, scientific attitude. So temperamentally, Indian languages, most of all of the Indian languages, not only Hindi, Marathi or Assamese or Bengali, they remained completely devoid of scientific temperament. They continued to be the language of mysticism. They, they continued to remain the language of literature. Fine, there are great literature, undoubtedly, and the literature in Indian language can be compared with the world literature. Rather, it's an injustice that Indian literature in Indian languages have not been properly evaluated. If they are evaluated, then the Indian literature of Indian language will surpass. I believe it will surpass. It is far better, far superior than European languages. No doubt about it. Indian literature is far superior. I have read, and I'm proud of having read the Indian literature. But equally, I am also pained that my languages, Indian languages, were not developed into temperamentally scientific languages. That would have been possible only when the original science work would have taken place in India. When you conduct science, when you conduct research, then you write it in your own language. But but your conduct is literature, philosophy, and mysticism, right? Conduct is not science. Then you are dependent on others. Maximum what you can do is you can translate. So, by very historical legacy, you are becoming dependent on translation. I have always said, and I must repeat, that no question of language is the question of language alone. It's never the question of language. It's the question of knowledge. If you produce knowledge, original knowledge in your language, nobody is going to stop you. You needn't ask somebody else to make your language a great language. But if you are manufacturing your knowledge in the form of literature only and philosophy and mysticism, then this is what you are producing, this is what you are manufacturing as knowledge. So your language will be the carrier of the language which you are producing. It will never be the carrier of science and technology. So the question is not about language. The question is about knowledge. Whether your language is capable of producing the original knowledge in your own language or not. Knowledge is being produced somewhere else in their language, and you are just depending on copying it through translation. So your language is bound to be a translating language. So the strength of a language is not determined by how many people speak, whether others can use your language or not. No, the strength of your language is determined by the fact that whether you are the originator of the knowledge in your language or not. Now, having said this, let us come to the next question, and that is about what was the scope and possibility of Hindi being adopted as India's language of education, which could have been equally accepted by all parts of India. So the people of North India, they have certain problem, and I've always said that language is no different from the people who speak the language. So the question of language is the question of people, right? Hindi is spoken in North India. North India is a great part of the world, like any other part of the world, but it has its own problems, and their language is the carrier of those problems. So the North Indian people had some problem. They have some great strength as well. We'll discuss the strength, and their language Hindi is representative of their strength also. But so it was the failure of North Indian people to convince Assamese, Bengali, Tamil, Telugu, Marathi that how they are going to adjust with their languages. This was the failure. Means adoption of Hindi as India's language of education, how is it possible when Tamil is older than Sanskrit also. What to talk of Hindi? Then you have so old languages, Tamil, Telugu, right? And on the other hand, we have so great literature in Bengali, in Assamese, in Marathi, Gujarati. Then these people need to be convinced. How are you going to convince them that they should also accept and adopt Hindi? There was no effort, organized effort from North Indian people, the speakers of Hindi, to these people that how Hindi is going to convince them that Hindi is not a danger to their language. A formula was developed later on that North Indians should learn South Indian languages, South Indians should learn Hindi. But look at the result. South Indian did learn to some extent Hindi. Bengalis and Assamese and Nagas and others, they all learned Hindi. They all know Hindi. But what about Hindi people? The Hindi people, now this is the question of people, are still the most feudal in India. The most feudal. This is the problem of North India, and that is why this is the problem of Hindi language also. Feudalism is one such problem. Feudal mindset. Authoritarianism. Imposing our views on others rather than adjusting. So you can find Tamil people, Telugu people, all kinds of people somehow trying to adjust with Hindi, but what is the percentage of Hindi speakers in learning other languages? And Assamese can speak in Hindi, but is it possible for a Hindi speaker to converse and speak in Assamese and Bengali? A Bengali knows Bangla, Hindi, in Assamese also, no problem, and English also. India's destiny after independence was bound to be multilingual. Means an Indian could survive in India only whether he is Hindi speaker or Gujarati speaker or Tamil speaker. India's destiny was well written. If India has to survive, the Indians must be bilingual, trilingual, or multilingual. Multilinguality was our chosen destiny. If we digressed from this multilingual promise, then you cannot expect your language to emerge as national language. So Hindi speakers do not have any right to impose their language on others. If you can show the respect to other language, only then, only to that extent, you can expect that Hindi can be accepted and adopted by others. Hindi only can be imposed by bullet on rest of India. Otherwise, the solution is that Hindi speakers must learn at least 2-3 more languages. They should not treat Assamese Bengali as foreign language. They should not treat Tamil and Telugu speakers as foreigners. So Hindi speakers have greater responsibilities because a Telugu speaker, a Tamil speaker, a Malayali already knows something of Hindi. But what about Hindi speakers? How much they know about Tamil and Telugu? Even if you go by percentage, Hindi speakers are the least accommodative and least flexible least linguistic flexible. They consider that Hindi, they take it for granted that Hindi is, yes, Mahatma Gandhi sometimes said, it's a national language. They're full of this pride. This pride has become the pride, rather, that's ruffianism. It's Gundaism. It's proper Gundaism. Expecting other speakers, the speakers of other languages, that they must speak Hindi, but you are the master, you are the Malik. All should adjust according to you, but you will not show any respect. What to talk of speaking and learning their own language? Least respect. I'm not saying this is, but if you, this is not general thing. There are scholars who are respectable to other languages of India also, but general mass and the public in these people, They are least linguistic flexible. India's destiny was the kind of history India has, linguistic diversity. After adoption of constitution, India has only one destiny, linguistic, multilinguality, multilinguality. Every citizen of India was expected to know more than one language. English was not an imposed language. English was the language of India's administration. It was not possible to dump it. Somehow it connected whole of India in administrative functioning. But that didn't mean that they were not allowed to use their own language. Even with English, other Indian languages could have easily developed. Now, if you come to the question of English, then the question is in English a foreign language? To what extent is foreign? Yes, it is a foreign language. It has come from outside. Its history in India is 300. In that sense, most of the languages are foreign languages. Urdu, Persian, they were all foreign languages, but they became eventually in course of historical development. The rulers from anywhere, they brought their own language and that became the local language. So Persian was also a foreign language and it got mixed with Hindi and uh, gave birth to Urdu. So Urdu was totally indigenized. It became an Indian language. When a language serves your purpose, then what is the logic in saying that it's not your language? When English serves this purpose of India, it brings business and economy to India. It brings science and technology to India. It has given maximum number of scientists and technocrats. So whatever knowledge India has, that's in English. Scientist, technologist, business, economist, the entire modern identity of India is based on English. It is in English that the solutions are found for poverty, solutions are found for diseases, everything. In the similar manner, English is as much an Indian language as any other language. More solutions for Indian problems are present in English, and this is Indian English. So Indian English is as much an Indian language as any of the Indian languages themselves. Sometimes it is said. So let us apply this logic कि हमारा जो language है, native language, that is the guarantee for inventiveness. This is a fact, but exaggerated fact. The fact is that the people who learned and mastered and adopted a foreign language, there was no difference in a native language and a foreign language. There's an exaggerated debate that a language remains permanently a foreign language. No. If it is totally indigenized, if it is nativized, if it is internalized, if it starts serving your own purpose, if it serves the purpose of saving your own identity, if it starts solving your own problem, if the solution comes from that language, and it is evidenced that Indian economy, where it is impossible to be where it is without English, there are some duplicate people, hypocrite, ignorant and illiterate, without knowing the history of Indian languages and English and what English has done for India. These are the people who are eating because of English, but eventually, all of a sudden, overnight, they are trying to become Hindi patriot. These are the people who do not know how to write correct Hindi. They cannot write correct one sentence Hindi. Just for political purpose, they have suddenly become the supporter of Hindi. If you go into the original analysis of Indian economy started doubling after globalization. It's business out process, it's BPO, it's NPO, it's LPO, it's science and technology that has contributed to the rise of modern Indian economy. And everyone in India, service class, middle class, mostly the government, employees, they are the biggest beneficiary of this rising Indian economy. How do they get their salaries? Whether you are a professor of Hindi, or you are a government employee, police officer. You get your salary for government of India, from government of India, or other state governments. How do these governments give their salary? It comes from economy, rising economy. And how economy has risen, economy has developed because of English. After 1991, it was English revolution in India. Economic revolution that has happened in India in the last 20 years, let us accept, be honest. Who has created this Indian economy? What has been the contribution of English language in that? Who has brought FDI in India? NRIs. Who were NRIs? Those who got education in English. They went to English countries. They earned into billions, and they brought the money into India in the form of FDI and FII. Who has driven this economy? Who has caused this economic revolution in India? Who has taken this Indian economy from less than $1 trillion at 1991 to this $3 trillion? It's all the power of English language. The fact is that English is in India totally internalized, indigenousized. It is an Indian language. It's completely Indianized. It's a completely Indian language. It serves more Indian interests than Hindi or any other language. You want solution. You need solution. You need solution. Right? And the solutions have come to India from English. To that extent, English is an Indian language. It must not be questioned and doubted now. That would all be hypocrisy and nothing. Now let us come to the problems with Hindi. The problems with Hindi are, as I said, first, Samantwad, feudalism. Second problem is, the Hindi is the language of politicians. The biggest beneficiary of Hindi language are corrupt, seasoned politicians. If politics is corrupted, if politics has problem, it is because of politicians using Hindi language. Third is, Hindi as a language is the murderer of hundreds of local dialects. Hindi is not my language. Hindi is not my language. It's a borrowed language. The way I have borrowed English, similarly I have borrowed Hindi. My language is Bhojpuri. I was born in Bhojpuri. Now they can say that Bhojpuri and Hindi. No. Bhojpuri has been murdered, assassinated by Hindi for the survival of Hindi. Hindi is surviving by sucking the blood of several dialects. ब्रज, अवधी, भोजपुरी, राजस्थानी, ये मिथिला, इनके ब्लड पर पलता है हिंदी लैंग्वेज. Third problem or fourth problem of Hindi language is that the modern Hindi language is totally Marxwadi Hindi language. It's Marxist Hindi. Its entire phraseology and muhavra and its entire jumlabaji, it's totally Marxist language. So what you prescribe and present as Hindi language, इसमें science नहीं है. There is no science and technology in it. It is the language of Marxism. Hindi is the colony of Marxism. Learning Hindi is learning Marxism. It is in the blood of Hindi. Hindi is in the Marxism, leftism. They have nothing to do with the cultural heritage of India. They have distorted India's culture, Marxism. They have finished, they have cut, they have dissected, they have murdered the conscience of Indian civilization. So unfortunately, the Hindi which I read, that's a European Hindi. That's उसके अंदर जो blood है वो भौतिकवाद का blood है. That's European materialism. That is Marxist materialism. So modern Hindi is more the Marxist materialism. It carries in its conscience the Marxist phraseology. So ये हिंदी हिंदुस्तान की हिंदी नहीं है, ये भारत की हिंदी नहीं है. It is ये भारतीय संस्कृति की संवाहक नहीं है. इसकी धमनियों में मार्क्सवाद का खून दौड़ता है. इसकी धमनियों में मार्क्सवाद का खून दौड़ता है. ये मार्क्सवाद की कॉलोनी है, हिंदी मार्क्सवाद की कॉलोनी है, उपनिवेश है. ऑन दी अदर हैंड इंग्लिश इज सो रिच, उसमें मार्क्सवाद है तो उसमें उसमें थाउजेंड्स ऑफ व्यूज है. इंग्लिश इज मोर इंडियन because of the conscience of Indianism, conscience of Indian civilization can be found and can be felt more generally and more intensely in English than Hindi. Hindi is a Marxist language, especially its modern language, at its modern form. इसमें जितनी मैगजीन्स आती है ये सब मार्क्सिस्ट निकालते हैं. ये सब वो लोग हैं जिनको भर्तृहरि, कालिदास, भवभूति, जो इंडिया के क्लासिक लिटरेचर, इनको दे डोंट नो एनीथिंग. दे आर रूटलेस पीपल. हिंदी में जितनी मैगजीन्स आती है दे डू नॉट नो नथिंग अबाउट इंडियन हिस्ट्री एंड कल्चर. जो जानते भी है वो मार्क्सिस्ट, दैट्स मार्क्सिस्ट ट्रांसलेशन. जितनी हिंदी में जर्नल्स मैगजीन्स आती है वो सब दे आर ऑल, वो सब के सब दे आर रूटलेस. भारत की संस्कृति और सभ्यता का प्राण तत्व उसके अंदर नहीं है. ये मार्क्सवाद का उपनिवेश है. So this Hindi must not be imposed on me, because for me it's not the battle of English, battle for English. It's the battle for Indian, and you are not Indian. Rajatarangidi is more effectively present in English than Hindi. Saivadvaita, the Indian philosophy. The only benefit which Hindi could have that was because of its legacy flowing from Sanskrit, but it is totally cut off from Sanskrit. Not in script. Script may be the same, not in language. So script संस्कृत और हिंदी का एक ही है, बट प्राण तत्व अलग अलग है. संस्कृत का प्राण तत्व अलग है, हिंदी का प्राण तत्व यूरोपियन मार्क्सवाद है. ठीक है. It's totally cut off from Indian value system, Indian culture. It doesn't know. If you're in English, then you know Valmiki more authentically than the Hindi people. अगर मार्क्सवाद ही सीखना था तो हिंदी में क्यों सीखे? ओरिजिनल क्यों नहीं सीखे? The better version of Marxism is available in English than Hindi. If I have to be the master of Marxism, then why to go via such a second grade language translated by third grade people? I will go to original, that is in English. If I have to become the expert of Marxism, then I will read it in original English. English में सारा Marxism available है, right? The next problem with Hindi is that it is casteism. हिंदी में जो भी डिबेट्स है ये कास्ट बैटल है. ये हिंदी का जो मॉडर्न डिस्कोर्स है इट्स नथिंग बट कास्टिज्म. कास्ट वॉर है. It's full of caste war. It's total caste war. Studying and knowing Hindi is about knowing caste war. Right? ये गाली गलौज, entire discourse है गाली गलौज है. इधर से गाली उधर, उधर का उधर. तो Hindi has become the language of गाली गलौज. Scientific temperament totally lost. So what is presented in Hindi in the name of discourse, that's गाली गलौज, caste war है, सामंतवाद है. भारतीयता का प्राण तत्व completely absent है हिंदी में, और ये मार्क्सवाद का उपनिवेश है. So such a language must not be imposed. If you are really concerned about Hindi language, then you must make Hindi following carrier of scientific temperament, free from feudalistic mindset, free from the hegemony, sense of hegemony, that it can be imposed on all the other Indian languages and Hindi will rule. Hindi is the language of corrupt politician, right? So long as Hindi continues to be infected with these problems, can never expect to be the language of India. India is too vast. It is so vast. Most of these problems apply to other Indian languages also. Assamese, agar if this logic is accepted that original language में inventiveness होता है, right? I started with this argument. Original language में inventiveness होता है, तो हिंदी में, असमीज में, बांग्ला में कोई आइंस्टीन क्यों नहीं बन गया? Why there are no great scientists in this languages? इतना ओरिजिनलिटी, अगर इतना ओरिजिनलिटी का शौक है, तो आपके लैंग्वेज में कोई आइंस्टीन, कोई अमर्त्य सेन, आई मीन कोई इतने बड़े नोबेल प्राइज विनर क्यों नहीं हुए? The fact is that the originality in your native language is also a fact. Intelligence does depend on native language, but let me conclude by saying this, that multilinguality brings better and greater intelligence than unilinguality. If you are multilingual, you have greater chance of being brilliant. So Indians cannot afford to enjoy the luxury of one language. If you call yourself Indian, must look at the vastness of Indian. Go beyond Hindi land. Accept the reality that in India there is Tamil Nadu also, there is Telugu also, there is Malayalam also. If you can learn these languages, only then there is any importance, significance of Hindi. हिंदी को आप दूसरे के ऊपर इम्पोज नहीं कर सकते. If you are truly Indian and you want that your Hindi should be Indian, not the language of this North India, then you must learn other language and English essentially. Multilinguality is the key to survival in India, key to success in India. Intelligence, inventiveness, greatness in India will all come not by adopting one language, but only by adopting multilinguality. Multilinguality is greater chance of intelligence. If you learn 2 languages or 3 languages or 4 languages, you have the chance to be much more intelligent than one language. In India, the destiny is multilinguality. Hindi needs to correct itself.